Welcome. We're jumping straight into something huge today, but also, well, completely invisible. It's about this deep link between the ocean, that massive blue world out there, and the very air we're breathing right now. We've gathered some really interesting sources looking at the surprising power of tiny ocean life. And our mission really is to unpack what this phrase means. Every breath from the ocean.
Yeah, that phrase, every breath from the ocean.
Yeah.
It might sound a bit poetic at first, maybe like something you'd see on a poster, but as we dig into the material, you'll see it's actually grounded in some very real biology and chemistry. It's quite literal. So yeah, our goal is to stitch this information together, give you really clear insight into this ecological connection. Make sure you walk away understanding the ocean's, well, fundamental role in keeping things going on this planet.
Okay, let's start with the main character, so to speak.
Yeah.
When we think about where oxygen comes from, most of us probably picture, the Amazon rainforest, big forests up north, the lungs of the land. That's the usual image. But if we're talking about the real powerhouse for the planet's air, we need to look underwater to the lungs of the sea. And that means we have to talk about plankton.
Exactly. And plankton itself is a bit of a catch-all term, isn't it? It covers this huge, diverse group of organisms. Technically, it's anything that just drifts with the ocean currents. But for this discussion, for the atmosphere, we're really zooming in on one specific group, phytoplankton.
Phytoplankton. Okay, the phyto part gives us a clue.
Okay.
Like
It does.
photosynthesis.
Absolutely. Phytoplankton are essentially the microscopic plants of the ocean. They're the photosynthesizing engines down there. Totally distinct from zooplankton, which are the tiny little animals that often eat the phytoplankton. But the key thing, the core insight here, is that phytoplankton soak up carbon dioxide CO2 from the air and the seawater. They use sunlight for energy, and then, crucially, they release oxygen. It's a byproduct for them, but essential for us.
Wow. So it's the same basic process as a giant tree, just millions and millions of tiny versions doing it.
Precisely. Just on a microscopic scale, but happening everywhere.
It's still kind of hard to grasp how something so small can do such a massive job. I mean, we know trees are big, we see forests. How does this invisible stuff compete, or even, as the sources suggest, beat the output of all the land plants combined?
Well, it comes down to two things, mainly. Coverage and speed. Ubiquity and scale, you could say. Think about it. Forests are obviously limited to land, phytoplankton. They cover over 70% of the Earth's surface, basically the entire sunlit part of the ocean. It's like a continuous living skin across the planet.
70%. Okay.
And they reproduce incredibly fast. Under good conditions, enough light, enough nutrients, a single cell can divide and multiply into millions within just a few days. This rapid turnover means they're constantly pulling in carbon and pushing out oxygen at a rate that, yeah, most land ecosystems just can't keep up with.
That speed, that turnover,
Yeah.
it suggests they're not just floating passively, they're actively, driving planetary chemistry.
Oh, absolutely.
You mentioned they absorb CO2 from the water, which gets it from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Can you just quickly clarify that link? It makes the ocean sound like this huge gas regulator.
It really is the ultimate regulator in many ways. There's this constant exchange of gases happening at the ocean surface. Air meets water. So when CO2 from the atmosphere dissolves into the surface water, the phytoplankton are right there, ready to grab it for photosynthesis. And because they're constantly using it up, it creates this draw, like a sink, allowing the ocean to pull more CO2 out of the air to maintain equilibrium.
Okay.
And then the oxygen release works in reverse. They produce oxygen, it dissolves in the water, and then it diffuses back out into the atmosphere for us.
Right, which brings us perfectly to this next idea from the sources, the ocean's breath. This is where that sense of scale really lands, I think. It sounds powerful, doesn't it? Much bigger than just individual cells. How did scientists even start to measure this? Because for ages, the common wisdom was all about forests, right?
Yeah, that was the assumption for a long, long time. Forests are the main lungs. And it makes sense visually, you see forests. But that view really got overturned quite dramatically, actually, in the second half of the 20th century. New methods came along, things like satellite imagery, which could see chlorophyll patterns across vast oceans, combined with isotopic tracers and detailed ship-based sampling. Scientists could finally start measuring primary production, the rate of photosynthesis across the entire globe, including the oceans.
And what did they find? What's the big aha moment here that flips our perspective on where our air actually comes from?
The aha moment is pretty staggering. The data showed that the ocean, specifically these phytoplankton, is responsible for somewhere between 50%, and some estimates go as high as 80% of all the oxygen produced on Earth each year.
50 to 80%.
Yes, we often use a conservative figure, say at least 50%, but think about that. At least half of the oxygen molecules you're breathing in right now were made in the sea by these microscopic organisms. That's the ocean's breath. It's this enormous invisible volume of life-giving gas generated daily, globally, by phytoplankton.
Half. At least half.
That's great.
That's not just helping out. That's a major partner, maybe even the dominant partner, with land plants. It's genuinely mind-boggling to think the single biggest engine keeping us alive is something we can't even see without a microscope. It really forces you to rethink the planet's basic setup.
It absolutely does, and it's not like it happens evenly everywhere either. The breath is stronger in some places than others. Usually it's areas where ocean currents bring nutrient-rich water up from the depths to the surface. We call that upwelling. That fuels massive phytoplankton blooms, sometimes so big you can see them from space. These blooms, often in cooler waters, temperate or polar regions, they're the real hotspots for oxygen production. Knowing where they are is pretty key to understanding the whole system's vulnerability.
That raises a really critical point, doesn't it? About, well, security in a way. If half our air depends on these specific productive zones in the ocean, zones that are mostly invisible and maybe sensitive to change, it suggests the foundation of our life support might be more delicate than a big visible forest.
That's the core realization, I think. The health of that top layer of the ocean, the euphotic zone where sunlight reaches, and the phytoplankton live and photosynthesize. Its condition is directly tied to the amount of oxygen getting pumped into the atmosphere. So any significant change in ocean temperature or its chemistry, it poses a fundamental threat to how efficiently this whole oxygen-making process works.
Okay, let's pivot then. Let's bring this right back to the listener. Someone tuning in might be, I don't know, sitting in Chicago or Denver, miles and miles from any coast. So what does all this, the plankton, the oxygen, the ocean's breath, what does it mean for them personally? How does it apply?
It applies through that core idea we started with. Every breath is ocean. That's not just a nice saying. It's a direct, physical, chemical fact. It basically collapses the distance. When you inhale right now, wherever you are, statistically speaking, 1 out of every 2 oxygen molecules you just took in was generated by a tiny marine organism, an organism that needs a healthy ocean, the right temperature, the right nutrients to survive and do its job. It connects everyone, everywhere, directly to the sea.
It really changes the whole conversation around conservation, doesn't it? It shifts from, maybe an abstract idea about protecting ecosystems far away to something much more immediate, like atmospheric stability, even self-preservation.
Exactly. That's the practical application right there. If every breath relies on the ocean, then the health of the marine ecosystem isn't some side issue. It's absolutely central to human well-being, to survival. It forces us to think critically about stewardship, about our impacts, even regarding actions that seem totally unrelated to the sea, things happening far inland.
Let's get specific on that. What are the main threats to phytoplankton, to their productivity that the sources highlight? And how do those threats potentially choke off this ocean's breath?
Well, there are a couple of major stressors mentioned, and they tie directly back to human activities, even those happening far from the coast. First, there's ocean warming, climate change. Phytoplankton are adapted to specific temperature ranges. As the surface water warms up, it tends to form a stable layer on top, like oil on water.
Stratification.
Exactly, stratification. This layering effect prevents the colder, nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean from mixing upwards to the surface where the phytoplankton live. So less mixing means fewer nutrients, things like iron, nitrogen, phosphorus, reaching the phytoplankton. That limits their growth, reduces their productivity, and ultimately means less oxygen gets produced.
So climate change isn't just about sea levels rising or coral bleaching. It's potentially starving the very organisms that make half our air.
Wow. Okay, what's the second big stressor? The second major one is nutrient pollution. This often comes from things like agricultural fertilizer running off fields, sometimes hundreds of miles inland, washing down rivers into the sea. Initially, all that extra nitrogen and phosphorus can cause a huge but kind of unnatural and unsustainable phytoplankton bloom right near the coast.
Like an overdose of fertilizer.
Sort of, yeah. But these massive blooms often die off very quickly. They sink down into the water column, and as bacteria decompose all that dead organic matter, the bacteria use up oxygen in the surrounding water. This process can create huge areas with very low or zero oxygen, what we call dead zones, where fish and other larger marine life simply can't survive.
That sounds like a really vicious cycle. You get a temporary boom in the plankton, maybe even a temporary oxygen spike right at the surface, but then it leads to this massive oxygen crash deeper down, killing off other marine life and messing up the whole balance.
Precisely. It disrupts the equilibrium. So the goal isn't just, keeping the ocean alive in a general sense. It's about maintaining the very specific, quite delicate chemical and physical balance that allows phytoplankton to function efficiently as our planet's life support system. And this connection means that things like managing fertilizer use better on farms or reducing industrial runoff way upstream suddenly become critical issues for atmospheric health, not just water quality.
That shift in perspective is really profound. It genuinely moves the argument beyond just save the whales or protect coral reefs, important as those are, to something like safeguard the air supply. The application of this knowledge seems to be recognizing that almost any decision we make about how we use resources, whether we live near the coast or are completely landlocked, eventually ripples outwards and downwards to impact this absolutely critical yet incredibly fragile component of our atmosphere, the microscopic life in the ocean.
And that fragility is key. You mentioned turnover earlier. Because phytoplankton populations reproduce and die off so quickly, the whole system can react to changes, good or bad, much faster than, say, a forest ecosystem with thousand-year-old trees. If ocean conditions keep changing for the worse, the potential reduction in oxygen production could happen much more rapidly than we might intuitively expect. It's not a system with huge buffers.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, really taken that deep dive. We established that fundamental link, these tiny phytoplankton generating at least half our oxygen, marine photosynthesis. We got a sense of the incredible scale, what the ocean's breadth really implies. And maybe most importantly, we've really cemented that direct personal connection, that idea that every breath is ocean, making marine health a matter of personal necessity for everyone.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought for you to take away, something to mull over as you go about your day breathing this ocean air. If half your air comes from this invisible marine world, what are the best signs, the best indicators of its health that you should actually pay attention to? Maybe focus less on the big, visible animals for a moment and more on the underlying chemical vital signs. Things like the rate of ocean temperature increase or the rate of ocean acidification. These are the direct indicators of stress on the phytoplankton. And therefore, in a very real sense, they're the vital signs for your own life support system.
That's a potent thought. The real security of our atmosphere measured in parts per million of chemicals in the deep blue. We really hope this deep dive has given you a quick, solid understanding of just how fundamentally important the ocean is, not just out there, but right here for your everyday life.